Hello and welcome to the Munk Dialogues. My name is Rudyard Griffiths. I'm normally the host of the Munk Debates. We're often talking to you from the stage here at Roy Thompson Hall in downtown Toronto, but tonight I'm in a studio hosting this, the fourth in our Munk Dialogue series. The purpose of this series is to encourage all of us to think about what is the world going to be like after COVID-19. This we know, at some point, it may be months, it may not be until next year or even longer, but there will be effective therapies. Let's hope there will be a vaccine for COVID-19, and we will move from this pandemic, this crisis that we're in now, into a post-COVID world, a world that will have changed as a result of this pandemic in a whole host of different ways, from how we work, to the collective values that we share, to our politics, and most importantly, probably to our international relations, our place in the world and the global institutions that we have used over the last 50 years or more to pursue our common objectives and our common security. Tonight on this, our fourth Munk Dialogue, we have the opportunity to speak with one of the world's leading thinkers about international affairs, global politics, and international institutions. She's someone that I had the pleasure at the very first Munk debate back in 2008, 2009 to host here in Toronto. Her name is Samantha Power. She distinguished herself early on after graduating from Harvard University as an Irish American immigrant, as a war correspondent for U.S. News and World Report. She's one of the leading human rights scholars of her generation. She's had an active career of public service, serving on the U.S. Security Council under President Barack Obama and later being appointed by President Barack Obama as the United States' representative at the United Nations. And she's the Pulitzer Prize winner for a terrific memoir. I really urge all of you, if you haven't read it already, use the opportunity of the extra time that we all have in our hands to break the back, to leaf the spine of The Idealist, a terrific memoir, again, that won the Pulitzer Prize and is a New York Times bestseller, The Education of an Idealist by Samantha Power. Well, here's Samantha Power. Let's bring her up and welcome her to the Munk Dialogues. Samantha, great to have you on the program.
Good to be back in different circumstances.
Yeah, well, next time, let's make sure that we can do this in person, but really appreciate you joining us for this fourth conversation in our series. We want to spend this hour talking with you, Ambassador Power, about international institutions, about our collective security, and how these aspects of the world that we knew before this pandemic will change. So let's begin by getting your reflections, your thoughts on what do you think will be the lasting legacy, not next month, but in the years to come, in terms of how this pandemic will change and reshape and refashion our institutions, and maybe more importantly, our perceptions and our pursuit of collective security. What's your view on that?
Well, I think human beings are agents in the answer to that question. And so in a way, it's incumbent on all of us to create the kind of outcomes, the lesson learning, the acceleration of the right set of trends and not the wrong set of trends. But in the short term, there's no question that the U.S.-China rivalry has grown already just in the few short months of this pandemic, much more severe, much more pronounced. That, of course, translates into gridlock in the UN Security Council, the premier international body for making and enforcing peace and security. Nationalism, which was on the rise anyway in advance of this pandemic, likely will get a short-term boost as particularly certain leaders with illiberal leanings or xenophobic leanings point to the pandemic as evidence of what happens if you mingle your fate with that of people who live elsewhere. So I'm sure border closures that you've seen up to this point are regulations that some leaders will seek to keep in place well after the pandemic has passed. Inequality, of course, we have seen surging inequality in recent decades. And because the pandemic is going to have a disparate impact, a much more pronounced and deadly lethal impact on poorer communities, those trends, both in terms of inequality among nations or between nations, and then inequality within nations, you're likely to see those trends exacerbated. But that's in the sort of short to medium term, some pretty worrying potential outcomes. in terms of the contest that we've all known awaited us in the 21st century between authoritarian capitalism enshrined in the China model and democracy enshrined, we thought at one point in the American model, but let's just now say in the Canadian model. We still have a democracy here, but it's certainly fraying in certain ways, if not around the edges, sort of at its spine, and we could come back to that. But that model, this is a complicated pandemic in terms of how it impacts people's understanding of which model of governance delivers for citizens. So you have China's gross mishandling of the earliest stages of the pandemic, the arrest of doctors and public health professionals who were trying to raise the siren of what was unfolding in Wuhan and beyond, a culture of fear that shows you and reminds you how dangerous it is to have authoritarian governance in place where people don't feel comfortable sharing truthfully information. The stakes of that cover-up, of course, are now being felt all around the world as the fact that so many outside countries did not begin taking preparations as soon as they should have, in part, only in part, but in part because China itself was not fully transparent. And so then you have the American model, of course, which has been an almost unmitigated disaster in terms of the top-down handling of the pandemic. But that stems as much from qualities of the particular leadership that we have in the United States right now as it does from anything inherent, I think, in the democratic model. So we have a president who, as it happens, doesn't have a lot of respect for science, has ridiculed expertise within his own administration as the deep state, doesn't really appreciate the utility of a free media, and frowns upon, and indeed is quite hostile to, global cooperation and international institutions. So that set of qualities don't come necessarily with democracy, but they have come with this president. And yet we see New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, Taiwan, Germany, other democracies really thriving, I mean, as much as one can in a pandemic, but really showing the utility of science-based policymaking, transparency, democratic accountability, where Prime Minister Ardern is out there every day talking to her people very truthfully, and Chancellor Merkel doing the same very soberly, and bringing the community into the struggle in the way that democracies have, I think, a unique ability to do. So that, I think, question of which model is going to be ascend into the 21st century, again, it's the particular decisions of particular leaders and then the impression that it leaves broader publics as to which is more effective in dealing with issues of life and death for their people. While it is absolutely true that, as I said, in the short term, illiberal leaders have put in place emergency decrees, some of which, of course, were necessary in light of the pandemic, but some of which were opportunistic. Many people, like Prime Minister Orban in Hungary, will seek to make those sort of infinite decrees and make himself prime minister for life, and for there to be no expiration date on those decrees. But at the same time, illiberal leaders are exploiting this crisis to centralize power in their hands in what they hope will be, for long time periods. You also see people at the civil society level getting really creative about how to use technologies like this one to organize and to sort of take the protests that had been defining global politics over the course of the last couple of years, mainly protests around economic inequality and corruption. But those protests are now taking form in different ways as people, again, necessity is the mother of invention, and people learn how to try to hold their governments accountable in new ways. We're living that here in the United States because, of course, we're in the midst of a presidential election and watching Joe Biden, the ultimate sort of backslapping politician who's so used to being out on the streets and having, those close conversations and relationships with voters, now having to learn how to organize on the fly from his own basement, like the rest of us. It's going to, in the short term, again, pose real challenges to organizing and to checks and balances on state power. But in the medium and the long term, I think we will figure out how to transcend some of these barriers. And then the last thing I'd say, just in terms of global institutions, which are more likely to face gridlock if the U.S. and China, for example, can't learn to cooperate on the UN Security Council, There's never been a crisis in my lifetime, at least, that better underscores the necessity of global cooperation and the need to invest far more in emergency preparedness, in the pooling of resources, in the creation of solidarity funds that will look out for the most vulnerable at times like this. The most vulnerable in our respective countries, of course, first and foremost, but also the vulnerable around the world, because what we are going to see in the medium term is the extent to which our ability in the United States to return to economic normalcy is going to turn on whether or not the supply chains are up and running in Bangladesh, in India, in sub-Saharan Africa. Our family ties, of second-generation Americans with Nigeria, Somalia, India. I mean, those family ties don't go anywhere, even if Donald Trump may wish us to be living back in the 18th century where we weren't connected in those ways. And so we're going to have a really hard time staging anything resembling a full recovery, particularly on the economic front, if we aren't looking out for developing countries and vulnerable communities around the world. And so that is going to be a very stark reminder of the need to solve the collective action problem that international institutions are there to solve, where each country gives a little so that we look out for those who don't have anywhere near the self-sufficiency or the infrastructure that the United States or Canada would have to deal with a crisis of this nature.
What's your view, Samantha, when it comes to the WHO, which really in some ways has become the center of a very heated debate, just not only about its decisions, but about the perceived utility of a potentially critical global institution and a perception, I don't know whether you share it or not, that one country in particular, China, has undue influence over this organization and has pursued its own kind of narrow national interests when it comes to managing this pandemic internally within China, and more importantly, trying to shelter China, the perception that being from blame around the origination of the pandemic, its sources, and their response or lack of response to its rapid spread.
Well, I think the first thing to say about the WHO, or to remind ourselves about it, is that it is an intergovernmental organization. I mean, I think people know that on one level, and yet at times like this, we sort of wish there were authorities there that transcended state power. But it is an organization of 194 member states. And the United States in the Trump years has, of course, pulled away from international organizations generally, but also the World Health Organization specifically. And there's no surprise there. Again, it's reflective of the Trump administration's view of science. It's reflective of its broader attitude toward international organizations. I think the president is of the view that these organizations rip America off, and that we give more to them than we get. It's only at a time of a pandemic that one realizes just how important it is to have such an organization. I hope at least that realization happens. But I mention this because, when the United States doesn't pay its dues on time, when it leaves its executive board seat at the WHO vacant, when it continues to second public health professionals to the WHO, as the Trump administration did, for example, from the CDC and the Health and Human Services Department, those secondments are incredibly important. But those officials are there. They know what's happening. They could be exerting significant influence within the WHO, but they're the deep state. They're the people that Trump had been marginalizing and attacking. And they would not have had great confidence that they would know what Trump's message should be in the midst of a crisis, given that Trump himself publicly was himself praising Beijing and President Xi for the response, and himself downplaying the pandemic. So in terms of the U.S. Ability to influence what was happening within the World Health Organization, it would have been at a mid-level, so it wouldn't have been at a sufficiently senior level. And if the individuals who were working at the WHO were simply mimicking President Trump's talking points, that would have led the WHO to take the very actions that it took, which were actions that I think in the early weeks were too reticent when it came to jumping up and down and really expressing in an almost emotional way, in a way that went beyond the bureaucratics, beyond the declaration of a global health emergency, but in a way that really underscored that this was a four-alarm fire that was afoot. And of course, the reason the World Health Organization didn't sort of talk about the virus at that time in that way, though it did declare it a global health emergency at the end of January, was that it was trying to secure access to get to China. And again, in an ideal world, not only the United States, but Canada, European countries, the Republic of Korea, Japan, all democracies together would have been clamoring for that access. But in a world where we're not teaming up as democracies anymore, that does create more of a vacuum that China is perfectly prepared, just as the United States always tried to fill every vacuum that it encountered in the international system. So too, China's doing the same. But to be clear, the U.S. contributes, before the funding cutoff, contributed 20% of the World Health Organization's budget. China, 2%. So to the degree that the United States was not exerting leverage and pressing the technocrats and the civil servants who run the WHO and who staff the WHO to be more forthright, as of course they should have been, I mean, in a way, that's on us. That's on all of us. All the other countries within the WHO who were allowing the single nation of China, which was responsible for just 2% of the budget, to be stonewalling the WHO as it was seeking access. So more candor from the civil servants at WHO for sure, but also let's look inward and examine the positions that we were taking and how hard we were pressing, each of us, the organization to do more. And by February, I think when you look back, the WHO response tracks with probably what you would have wished from it. It is true that the health regulations that the U.S. helped draft 15 years ago do frown upon, you might say, the sort of travel closures and the border closures that have been put in place by many countries. And so that's one of the other things that President Trump complains about. But again, the U.S. wrote those regulations, and at no point did the WHO condemn any country that put in place those closures. It just has a policy that asks countries that impose border restrictions to justify those restrictions publicly, to explain in a transparent way how they're doing the cost benefit between economics, public health, et cetera. And so I think, again, the early weeks, China, the WHO was trying to get access. It thought that by being nice to China and very polite and kind of holding its fire, that it would be better off. But when you're dealing with an authoritarian country, you are almost never in of right mind in playing their game rather than your own.
We're going to go to audience questions in a sec, but let me just squeeze one more in before we do. And I guess to have you think a little bit for us about collective security, because you spent time on the National Security Council of the United States as an appointee of President Barack Obama. You served at the United Nations, interacting with the Security Council. How does this pandemic change how we'll pursue our security? Because I guess what some people are positing is that this is a moment where nation states have really reasserted themselves, which is kind of interesting because, there was a period there up to this crisis in the decades before that people thought maybe the nation state was waning, the forces of globalization were making it less important, the nation state was better off seeking out its interests through multilateral institutions. That kind of seems like it's being pressure tested, those previous ideas, against a resurgence of the nation state. Where do you think, I mean, not maybe where you might like our collective security to be solved and thought about, but where do you think, Samantha, how that's going to fold out? Will the nation state take a new lead in the years to come after this pandemic?
Well, as somebody who had the privilege of working for an American president who really believed in the importance of strengthening global cooperation, of working through the United Nations, for example, on the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris Climate Agreement, the very robust Ebola response that the U.S. helped spearhead in support of the people and the countries of West Africa. So that's my experience is working for that guy, not this guy, but that guy. And what I can say is the nation state never went away, even in the Obama years. As one who helped President Obama use the United Nations as best we could to help assemble new international law, for example, to stop the terrorist financing of ISIS. As one who at least supported the President Obama's efforts to secure that Paris Climate Agreement. How did the Paris Climate Agreement come into existence? The U.S. and China, you recall, did a bilateral deal first in order to create the nucleus of a deal, and then went to the Europeans, to the small island states, and sort of together, and of course, very much with the support of UN officials, picked away at other countries that might have been skeptical, particularly India, which was one of the last outliers. And so, I mean, really, the nation state is not going anywhere. And the pandemic, as you absolutely rightly say, underscores the fact that the capabilities that citizens rely on for their health, for their lives, reside in government, in their own governments, right? There's, yes, it's true that the WHO has dispensed 2.2 million masks and gloves in the developing world, but that's only because those developing countries' governments have failed to provide that precious PPE. And so it's those vulnerable communities whose states can't deliver. The United States, for much of the last few months hasn't really been delivering, and because the federal government was failing, our states, the 50 states, have had to take on functions that they always imagined at a crisis like this would be taken care of by the federal government, like negotiating with foreign countries, as our governor of Maryland has done. But my point is simply that the pandemic has exposed something that has always been true about the workings of international organizations, and that is, it is the governments that comprise those organizations, and particularly, of course, the powerful governments, that are going to dictate whether those organizations are effective in standard setting, in holding countries accountable when they're not meeting those standards, and in looking out for public goods that vulnerable, developing, poorer, countries lacking in capacity themselves don't have the wherewithal to provide. And so when you ask the question, what will it be like after the pandemic and when the dust has cleared, I think your predisposition says a lot about how you're going to view this crisis. I think the Donald Trumps of the world and Stephen Miller, his anti-immigration advisor, they will look at this and say, we have to pull up stakes even more. We have to, pull up our supply chains out of countries that have created a vulnerability to disruption. We have to rely on one particular brand of American, a kind of homogenous 19th century look for America, where those family connections that I mentioned earlier don't exist. That's one way to look at this. But I think if you look at, again, the nature of global pandemics, the nature of global terrorism, the nature of global climate change, there simply is no way for the nation state to tackle any one of those problems without a vehicle for cooperation among other nation states. And indeed, more and more what we see, for example, from the Republic of Korea, which has really been the pioneer during this pandemic on testing. What did the Republic of Korea's government do? Did it devise the tests and then manufacture all of those tests themselves? No, it issued a call to the private sector at the earliest stages. What is going to happen on the vaccine? The Gates Foundation will have as much to do with whether or not we get a vaccine in an accelerated fashion as most governments in the United Nations. And so the number of stakeholders around providing these public goods is going to go well beyond the nation state. But when you see nation states like the United States sitting out the global response, or as Trump just issued an executive order or some regulation yesterday saying that USAID partners, our aid agencies, non-governmental partners around the world, are prohibited without written permission from providing any of the PPE that they have to developing countries, to poorer countries. They're not allowed. And by the way, this is not PPE that would go otherwise to Americans. This is PPE that the NGOs would be procuring outside U.S. borders. But that kind of attitude, which then often gets replicated by other countries, will mean that the pandemic will last longer, that our own first world economic hardships will last longer, because the developing world will be even more walloped by this pandemic, than current projections already predict.
Great insight, Samantha. We're going to go to questions from our audience. And before I do, just to alert viewers that we're going to have a special Canada bonus half hour at the top of the hour at 9 o'clock. We're going to have Professor Janice Gross-Stein on, who teaches at the University of Toronto, as a founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and a former Massey lecturer. Janice is going to have a discussion with me, picking up on Samantha Power's insights and analysis to really go deep and focus on Canada and how we're going to emerge after this pandemic in terms of our own international standing with these important international institutions that Samantha has been kind of guiding us through the last 20 minutes or so in terms of how they'll change in the years to come. Well, Samantha, I've got a whole bunch of audience questions that have come in via email and through our friends watching on Facebook. So I'm going to take these one at a time, read them to you so you can answer. This is from Rosemary McCarney. She's asking you, what are the 3 most pressing national security issues related to the pandemic that are keeping you up at night? So, Samantha, maybe like all of us, we're not sleeping that well. Do you have additional reasons to not be getting as much shut-eye maybe as you wish? What's your top 3 concerns?
I'm sure if we could read everybody's mind who's participating in this tonight, we could have quite the competition for the spooky doomsday scenarios that are keeping us up. I don't think there's ever been more insomnia in my household or among my peer group. But I would start with the deterioration in the U.S.-China relationship. And again, that's not a novel thought, but whether it's China planting conspiracy theories and really throwing its weight behind misinformation at a scale that we've never seen before around the false allegation that the United States was responsible for the virus, or whether it is President Trump and his rhetoric, calling it the Wuhan virus from the beginning, refusing even to agree to a G7 statement showing solidarity on the pandemic because he was so insistent that it be referred to as the Wuhan virus. Out of that grows intimidation, for example, of Asian Americans in this country, and even violence and other forms of a really quite severe harassment that I think we have to worry about in terms of the trickle down and the stigma that we need to count on our public officials to combat and not to exacerbate. But one wonders, as Democrats and Republicans alike rightly point to China's mishandling of the pandemic at the outset, and rightly, get very defensive and angry about the steps that President Xi is taking in terms of stirring nationalism and anti-foreigner and anti-American animus among the Chinese. You can agree again that all of that needs to be called out, just as the mass incarceration of the Uyghurs needs to be called out and unfair currency practices. But there still needs to be scope in the U.S.-China relationship for cooperation. And the scope for that cooperation on issues like climate change, where China is the world's largest emitter and is still building coal plants as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but with whom we are going to have to figure out how to negotiate a sequel to the Paris Agreement once the United States has lived up to the Paris Agreement from which it is attempting to withdraw. We are going to have to continue to cooperate on issues related to global health. We are not going to be able to wind the clock back and disentangle from China, which owns such a large share even of American debt. I mean, the ties that bind us are enormous and complex. And so as, again, this sort of demonization spirals, escalates a little bit, I get worried just that space for cooperation, which has to coexist alongside the absolute need for accountability for China's transgressions, its repression, its cover-up in the case of this pandemic. I worry that shrinks and that our national security is imperiled by that inability really to walk and chew gum at the same time. And it may just be that this is a period in time, but there are some deeper dynamics at work that make me think that this outright hostility, borderline, potential ultimate kind of quasi-Cold War could endure for quite some time. And then maybe just the second thing I would mention, just so we can get to other questions, because I have a long list of things that keep me up at night, would be just what I've referred to earlier as the walloping of the developing world is going to mean for security in those places. And then that will have knock-on effects on U.S. national security. So, the best case predictions, I think, from the Imperial College in London in the last week were 300,000 deaths in Africa, worst case, 3.3 million deaths. Now, those projections, just like I was saying at the beginning about broader projections about the trends in the world, individual changes and collective changes in behavior can bend those curves and can prevent those worst case scenarios from unfolding. But the economic damage across a continent like Africa, or in developing countries, or developing or vulnerable communities, even in more developed countries, or even a country like India or one like Bangladesh, you are going to see the toll that the economic knock-on effects of this pandemic take on security, on stability. We already saw it in Kenya as there were riots over the scarce food that was being made available in some of the more crowded slums just outside Nairobi. The security ramifications of an economic crisis, the likes of which we have not seen in our lifetimes, and arguably the world has not seen since the Great Depression, that could have cascading effects everywhere. Right now, the World Food Program is saying that 265 million people are vulnerable to severe malnutrition, if not outright famine. 265 million people. And what tends to happen then, you get a fight for scarce resources. Security forces themselves are hungry and themselves become part of the scrum rather than helping stabilize those societies. And, developed countries like ours that might be working through the UN, through peacekeeping, through other vehicles, to try to lend a hand, as we did during the Ebola crisis, we are so focused on our own crisis right now that we're not looking ahead. And the people who take advantage of economic meltdowns and political collapse and security collapse almost inevitably are hardliners, and that can take the form of terrorists and other extremists. But irrespective of who the exploiter of such conditions are, it's never good for regional stability or global stability.
Great. Let's go to another question that was emailed into us to questions at Munk Dialogues. When COVID is over, where do you think we'll see a dramatic rise in nationalism, populism, and anti-globalization sentiment? So where is that likely to occur? We've already seen Europe struggle with this in the last couple of years, a rise of the right in Europe. Are there other geographies, Samantha, that you're keeping an eye on to see where, whatever you want to call it, populism, far-right politics take hold in, as you say, this period of instability, economic, food security, and otherwise, that will spill out from this pandemic in the years to come?
Of course, it's hard to say, but I think that there will be elements in each of our countries that will point to this pandemic as grounds for hardening one's borders. I think it is an open question as to whether the illiberal right, if we put it that way, whether there is still much scope for growth. And I don't want to be complacent by any means. I mean, and my politics are evident, having worked, me having worked for the Obama administration. But just let's say if we correlate, illiberal right-wing parties with xenophobia or with an unwillingness to speak out against racism and other things, I mean, it could really cause a vicious spiral in terms of human rights abuse and hate crimes and other things. And we've seen that in places that the far right has gained traction. But, we were, before the pandemic, starting to see what appeared to be, I think also in Canada, but in many parts of the world, potentially people were speculating that maybe it was the high water mark had been reached, and now there was a tapering, in part because these illiberal forces, when they are actually given the authority and the mandate to govern, tend to centralize power, not address the inequality issues that were the ways in which they were actually the issues on which which they rode to power in the first place. But they're not fundamentally that interested in equality. They were interested in rising to power. And so you were starting to see some correction. And the best example of this was in Hungary in the recent parliamentary elections. But you've seen that, I think, in other parts of the world. countries that have been really generous opening their borders, like Colombia for the Venezuelan refugees. I think, again, you're likely to see a hardening of those borders. But there's a lot of economic interdependence. And so whether that can even be pulled off, much beyond the pandemic, it's not really clear. But that would be, I think, the most likely manifestation would be more mainstream parties becoming more drawn again to border controls, and so not necessarily embracing the illiberal rhetoric or the kind of exclusionary tone, but the notion of borderlessness, maybe coming to feel a little old-fashioned, a little 20th century. I think that trend, though, can coexist with many countries deciding to invest more in political international institutions, and so it's not. I don't know that all good things are going to go together, or all bad things are going to go together. I think you're going to see some a seemingly almost conflicting trend. So I could see the very countries that are, for example, really wanting to harden their borders from migrants who are trying to cross the Mediterranean, where they take the trend that's currently afoot in the pandemic and seek to make it a lasting trend of not allowing rescue. I mean, you can see governments that embrace the non-rescue policy for migrants at the same time thinking we should strengthen the WHO and recognizing that conditions in developing countries that push people out, or that from which people seek to flee, that we all still have an interest in pooling our resources to try to address those underlying conditions, or to strengthen a World Health Organization and its emergency response capability, because out of this crisis should be a recognition that our fates are tied to people in parts of the world that might have once, before the pandemic, felt further away.
Great analysis, great insights. Let's go on to another question that was submitted to us over the last 48, 72 hours for this dialogue. It's from Ralph. He's saying, several leading countries seem to be moving towards greater self-reliance. What can international institutions offer these countries that play into their nationalist tendencies while fostering international cooperation? So that kind of builds off your last answer, Samantha. How can those groups and people and constituencies within society that, as you say, are interested in throwing up borders, that are wanting to retreat from the burdens of collective security, what's the way to talk to them? What is the argument, either both emotional and rational, that you can use to pull them back into an understanding that in a complex, interdependent world, security is a collective exercise, not an individual exercise at the end of the day?
Yeah, well, again, I think that when it comes to economic globalization, those countries looking to be more immune to disruption, and I'd say the United States is probably high on that list, out of this crisis, will be looking to make sure that we can manufacture medical supplies that are vital to our health security within our borders, so that we're not dependent on factories in Wuhan for what we need to keep our citizens safe. So you could see a kind of recalibration there. And then there will be elements in this country, and perhaps in yours as well, that will want to go much further and will want to pull up stakes. But the businesses that we're not talking about state-owned enterprises in the United States or Canada, and so companies themselves will have a vote on that, and moving the manufacturing base closer to home or home, that also will be a business decision, and so there'll be a lot of chefs in that kitchen, shall we say, and it'll be very, I suspect, case specific and very hard to unwind the clock or go back in time again, as some would have us do. But I think the question is quite sophisticated about, in a way, how to message and talk to people who have that impulse, which is to pull up stakes and, seek to, in fact, go back in time. And so I suppose what I would say is, it won't be hard. We will have countless examples that will show just how the extent to which the American economy benefits from our trading relationships, the extent to which prices go up, when the wages that are paid to the workers go up. And so that's, again, a trade-off that may be worth making when it comes to certain industries, but it's not without a cost for the consumers, and consumers are going to feel that. So I think there's an all things considered cost-benefit discussion to be had. Mm-hmm. But also, and because the question was specifically about international organizations, I mean, I think international organizations could do a far better job. This has to do also with developing countries who are often recipients of financial assistance, or in this case, medical assistance, but of making it clear that they are a tool, they are a resource, they are a set of capabilities. So the World Health Organization has diagnostic tests that it can make available to a sovereign state that wants those tests. And you've already seen, well before the pandemic, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa really pushing back against the old school understanding of what international institutions were. You see, for example, in the Sustainable Development Goals, much more language of partnership and much more pushback by local and national actors in countries that are reliant to some extent on assistance from the UN and other agencies. But the conversation already has changed, and country plans now really needing to come from the actors in those countries themselves, instead of being bequeathed, by outsiders, as was so often the case. Now, the other issue there, of course, is that national governments often don't collaborate then with civil society or with the true stakeholders in the community. Often women are left out of the conversation. And so it's not as if we had gotten to some perfect place. But I do think, for the UN to show itself as having technical expertise that can be procured, but where sovereignty doesn't go anywhere, it's a menu from which a sovereign government can choose. You don't want to go too far in that direction, because there are obligations that the UN is the keeper of the norms and the keeper of international standards. We don't want that to be seen as any more than it already is, as take it or leave it. But I think that spirit of partnership, rather than again that sort of what can feel like a quite a condescending conversation, ends up being more important after a crisis like this.
Great. Let's go to our friends watching on Facebook. There's a lot on the live stream right now having their conversation about the dialogue that we're having here together. So we'll go to some of our Facebook questions. A question from Uno saying, the United Nations seems to be slipping into obsolescence. So Uno has a view here, take it or leave it. How can the UN be made more effective in handling future world crises like COVID-19? And I guess just to build on that, Samantha, I mean, there is a feeling, at least in the news reporting, in the sense of where the action to fight this pandemic is coming from, seems to be places other than the United Nations. Am I wrong to characterize the United Nations as kind of missing in action these last 6 to 7 weeks?
Well, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but the UN is an intergovernmental body comprised of countries. The two most powerful countries in the UN are the United States and China. Yeah. The United States is completely AWOL from international leadership, and even if it was present and attempting to lead the world, right now the only thing the United States is leading on in relation to the pandemic is the number of deaths caused by the pandemic. So that's probably not the kind of leadership that at least some countries are looking for. And China wouldn't even allow the issue to be brought before the UN Security Council, because in order to come before the Security Council, something is supposed to be a threat to international peace and security. And China was so defensive of it, and remains very defensive of its own reputation. And so it blocked the Security Council from acting. I think Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, former Prime Minister of Portugal, who knows a thing or two about international politics, but has had a pretty unfortunate hand dealt to him with the three of the five permanent members of the Security Council being Donald Trump, President Xi, and Vladimir Putin. But I think Guterres has done his best actually to agenda set. So he has called for a global ceasefire. I think more than 70 countries have embraced that call, or at least the idea that themselves not embracing the ceasefire, but embracing the idea that the whole world should get behind a ceasefire. And so far, the Security Council, because of the opposition of the United States and that of Russia, have resisted endorsing that, which again, at a time when we all need to be fighting one war, and that is the deadliest pandemic we've seen in more than a century, is a great shame. Guterres has also called for the easing of sanctions against countries that are suffering terribly in the pandemic, in part because of their inability to access humanitarian supplies from outside. So countries like Venezuela, Iran, Zimbabwe. That call also has been largely ignored, principally by the United States, of course, which is interested in ramping up sanctions against Iran at the time of the pandemic. So, it's easy to say the UN is obsolete, but say we start a new organization, are we going to get away from the fact that the United States and China are the two most powerful countries in the world? They will dictate the extent to which the world will rally, politically and rally resources to deal with any threat, irrespective of whether that's in a building that's called the UN or a building that's called 21st Century Central. I did do this Munk debate before at the very beginning, and I believe it was with Richard Holbrooke.
That's right.
Was on our debate stage together, and Richard, who passed away tragically nearly 10 years ago. But Richard used to say, and I don't want to let the UN off the hook, but I will offer you this quote from him. And I have a discussion of this in the Education of an Idealist. But he used to say that blaming the UN for a crisis is like blaming Madison Square Garden when the New York Knicks play badly. Okay. That on one level, you're blaming a building. And I think the WHO needs to be held responsible for the fact that its director general was not as outspoken as he should have been. But when I compare his responsibility or influence or his intelligence gathering capacity to that of the President of the United States and the U.S. intelligence agencies, it's night and day. And so I think to think about it more constructively, the answer going forward is how can we get, and I'm obviously very political here in the United States, so how can we get a different president who recognizes that you can't turn back the clock, but who also recognizes that these international institutions should be functioning with more nimbleness in the 21st century, that they should be more fit for purpose, but that member states themselves are the ones who write the rules for these organizations. So if the international health guidelines are going to change at the WHO, it's going to be U.S. negotiators and Canadian negotiators and Chinese negotiators that are in a scrum. And hopefully we can do a better job rallying the world's democracies to be part of a coalition and to be acting more together. Because as influential as China is, it's easy to forget just how powerful democratic nations are and could be within international institutions if we did a better job getting back to strengthening our alliances and got away from this kind of dog eat dog, each man for himself approach that President Trump has popularized.
Great answer. Well, I'm speaking with Samantha Power, the Pulitzer Prize winning author of the book, The Education of an Idealist, a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and a member of the U.S. National Security Council under President Barack Obama. Let's go to another question from our audience who've been joining us for this last period of time. It's from Sean. He's saying, it seems the president is moving to open the economy and lift restrictions sooner than the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. How do you see U.S.-Canada relations moving in the coming months as related to trade, non-essential travel, and policies, et cetera? I guess, Sean's getting at an issue here that's top of mind, Samantha, for many Canadians, the world's largest undefended border, a historic relationship between our two countries now stretching back centuries. We've now seen that border reintroduced and hardened in a way that we would never have expected in our own lifetimes. What's the future of Canada-U.S. relations in the years to come?
Well, let maybe just focusing on the disparity in our respective approaches, and to be fair, really to any leader at any level, in the United States, a lot of the decision making is being done, as you know, by governors, Republican and Democratic governors alike, thinking about this in different ways. But this is a really complex cost-benefit analysis where you have to weight the devastation caused by economic despair, mass unemployment, a complete shutdown, of the economy. At the same time, you weight the absolute indispensability of wrestling this pandemic to ground and ultimately eliminating it or containing it, until we can get a vaccine. So just to say that, unfortunately, I don't have the luxury of having a president who is, I think, all that motivated by that complex a calculus. I think a lot of what he's doing is very expressive and very self-contradictory. One day he's frowning upon the state of Georgia's early opening, and the next day he's saying liberate and encouraging mobs to storm state legislatures in Michigan and elsewhere. So again, we don't have the best model for how to do this complex weighting. But I think what will prove really important for Canada in the near term is close coordination with the governors of states in the northern part of the United States, because in terms of, it's not the only issue. What happens in the U.S. as a whole, of course, given that people can cross the border having come from anywhere. But, it is the case that those states that border Canada directly, each of them right now are having their own debates internally about how quickly to move. I think we have the ability to learn from one another. We can learn from countries like Denmark that have sent kids back to school. We can learn from a country like Taiwan that's producing more masks per minute per capita than any country in the earth. And so, maybe Canada also can learn from some of what happens in Georgia, Oklahoma, just as we in Massachusetts are trying to. There is a way in which the sort of staggered spread of the pandemic gave us lead time that we didn't exploit, sadly, to put in place the preparations we needed. But now maybe that experimentation at the state level can allow us to glean some lessons. I think the future of U.S.-Canadian relationship, it will turn in significant measure on what happens in November in this country. And, this is a very challenging time for electoral politics to play out. There are real questions, as we saw in Wisconsin, about how to balance, the importance of going forward with an election with the safety of those being asked to vote in person. And those questions are going to persist into the summer and maybe, depending on the pandemic, maybe into the fall. But in a world in which Trump continues to view the world in such zero-sum terms, even the thick bonds that we have between us are frayed over time by that attitude, by a belief that somehow what's good for you just must be necessarily bad for us, rather than the positive sum approach that I think successive U.S. and Canadian leaders had brought to bear. One plea, I guess, that I would have, irrespective of what happens in U.S. politics, and maybe one silver lining, we're not experiencing the silver lining yet, but one potential silver lining that could come is that as the U.S. has pulled back, there is an opportunity for middle powers to be pooling their wisdom, leading together. If the European powers combined with Canada, Korea, Chile, Colombia, if countries that are really trying to practice good governance and democratic accountability were to coordinate and cooperate, even with the U.S. on the sidelines, I think you would see the ability to learn from one another, for example, as to how to prevent misinformation and cyber attacks. I mean, actual core conversations about national security that can happen, with the United States on the sidelines. Those conversations should be happening. Learn on the pandemic, what has worked and what hasn't. I think that learning goes on, but it's quite anecdotal now because, again, there isn't an obvious forum for those discussions to be had. But also in terms of trade relationships, political partnerships, public-private partnerships. I think you're going, if the U.S. retreat from global leadership persists into a second Trump term, you will really see, I think, other countries stepping forward it's almost people are still almost in shock about just how abrupt the shift has been from President Obama to President Trump. And I'm not saying that everybody was so thrilled with President Obama, but just in terms of one's attitude toward one's allies, one's attitude toward human rights, one's attitude toward global cooperation, that's a really abrupt shift. And it's only now that you start to see countries beginning to flex their muscles and just say, hey, we may need to establish our own coalitions. We may need a middle powers bloc here if we're to prevent China from rewriting the rules of the internet. But so my hope is, as important and as critical as the U.S.-Canadian partnership is, that Canada also remembers how much it has to offer, potentially as a model of good governance, democratic accountability, standing up for human rights at a time when our leaders are more quiet on those matters, and being a kind of independent voice as relations between the U.S. and China deteriorate in the hopes that all of global cooperation doesn't shut down just because of the tensions between two superpowers.
Yeah, it's an important point. The opportunity to create new and different networks of kind of constructive global leadership. Let's squeeze in one more question, Samantha. There were a lot of you, so I just want to ask you to just extend with us a little bit beyond the top of the hour here, just to get a last question in from Lauren, who said, what advice would you offer international organizations given their response so far to this crisis? So Samantha, you alluded to that earlier in our conversation, that there might be some things that you could see that international organizations could do to more effectively position themselves. Maybe if you could answer specifically to the public and to people like Lauren who are out there right now trying to understand the value of these institutions, both to this crisis and to their lives more generally.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the international organizations point, but try to make it very succinct, and really focus more on sort of individuals, because I think one of the great risks in a pandemic is that each of us feels so small that can be quite disempowering. So let me come back to that in just a second. But on the international organizations, I think that Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, as I indicated earlier, I feel for him because he's had to spend a very significant share of his time as Secretary General just working the politics to try to ensure that Trump doesn't cut off funding to the UN and trying to maintain a good relationship with President Xi. And so it's not an easy job to have. But I think for him to do more of what he's been doing lately, which is not waiting for permission from the United States and China, for example, before staking out a position. And this gets back to some of the lessons that Canada taught the world in terms of international organizations and what they could be. I mean, to really, who's writing the checks, who's buttering the bread. I mean, there's no getting away from the influence that donor countries have to the UN, and how inevitably that's going to be in Guterres' head, and his concern about the UN getting defunded is a very legitimate concern. But I think to carve out an independent voice on behalf of the UN Charter, and to really to own the impartiality and the independence of that position. I think the same would be true of Tedros, the Director General of the WHO. Yes, there are these 194 countries that comprise the WHO. As I kept stressing in this discussion, these are intergovernmental organizations. But you're the one person who's carrying the flag for the global health principles and for the health of humanity. that don't have the power of the United States and China. And so the worst thing that happens is the United States and China, one of them gangs up on you and you lose your job. But I mean, how does that compare to looking back and saying, I wish I'd done more in the face of a pandemic? And so, again, I think both Tedros and the Secretary General have found their voices more as this pandemic has gone on. But I would encourage more independence of spirit. And again, countries like Canada, democratic coalitions can buck up the leaders of international organizations and remind them how many countries would be with them. And I think that's what's already happening on Guterres's global ceasefire initiative. And I would note that even though the Security Council has not embraced that because of U.S. and Russian skepticism primarily, actually a number of warring parties have. And so in such countries as Colombia and as the Philippines, you've actually seen that ceasefire get some traction. It's also created initial early momentum in Yemen, but that seems to have faltered. But just, staking out that authority and independence that people around the world count on you to have. It's not only the Pope who can use his moral authority. So that's on that. But then lastly, on individual agency, I have this expression that I come back to in the book, The Education of an Idealist, that I wrote, which is very much oriented for the young at heart and young people, but people who are really thinking about how to try to make a difference in difficult circumstances. And the concept I ended up honing in on, having been a war correspondent and a human rights activist and a professor, and then finally landing as a diplomat representing the United States, came from a book that I love, that I recommend for everybody, called Switch, by the Heath brothers, a Stanford and Duke pair of brothers. And the idea that the Heath brothers offer is this idea that when you're feeling small and when the problem just feels so much bigger than you can handle, shrink the change. Think about what is within your reach. It might require a stretch. You might have to go beyond what you ever thought you were capable of. But what is within your power to potentially make a difference on? Shrink the change. And when I was UN ambassador and I was sort of lamenting the human rights recession around the world, and this was in the Obama years, well before Trump, that could get overwhelming. And so my team and I, we just settled on a campaign to try to secure the release of 20 female political prisoners. So it was not going to change the world. It was 20 women around the world. And yet, by shrinking the change that we sought, we were able to get supported by others, including our Canadian friends. But 16 of the 20 women were freed from jail, and they went back into their communities and raised their voices and continued to try to tackle corruption and other things. It was tiny, but it was something, and it was tangible, and there's a sort of virtuous cycle that can take hold where you think, okay, so that's one very small thing. Now, what is the next task we can set for ourselves? And so I think with a pandemic, there's nothing bigger than a pandemic that is jeopardizing the lives of millions of people. But well beyond social distancing and washing our hands, I mean, it really lends itself to shrinking the change at an individual level. But what more can we do to try to change the trajectories that, as we talked about at the beginning, really could go in either direction? And often that's about civic organizing. It's about educating people around us. In my case, it's very much about politics. The 2016 election, which has so much to do with how this pandemic has been handled in the United States, and it's a life and death issue, it was settled by 78,000 votes. 78,000 votes spread across those three states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. 78,000 votes with tens of millions of votes cast. And 7% of the people who had voted in 2012 for Barack Obama stayed home in 2016. Just think of maybe the different conversation we'd be having tonight about the pandemic and about global cooperation if people had showed up, if young people had voted in the same numbers, if women had not diminished their participation as much as they did between 2012 and 2016. So shrinking the change to something small, but when you add up different people shrinking the change in different ways, it can make a profound difference. So
Well,
thank you.
well, thank you, Ambassador Powers. That's a great, optimistic, actionable insight that we can all take away from this discussion. And just again, to have someone with your breadth of experience, your knowledge of international institutions and global affairs on this, our fourth dialogue, has been a sincere pleasure. So Samantha, let's do this again in Toronto soon. When this is all over, we'll have you back for a Munk debate. I'd really enjoy that.
That'd be great. Thank you for having me. I'm grateful. Love Canada.
Okay, we'll get you up here. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Samantha Power. I just want to remind our viewers that we're going to continue this dialogue in a moment with Professor Janice Gross-Stein of the Munk School of Global Affairs. She's going to focus with me in the next half hour about how Canada will be changed through this pandemic internationally, through the international institutions that we've relied on. She's a professor of conflict management at U of T, a founding director of the Munk School, and a Massey lecturer, and we'll be going to her momentarily. Before I do that, I just want to thank and recognize a number of the groups and organizations, and also mention our upcoming dialogues. Next week, a dialogue that you will not want to miss. We're going to have Neil Ferguson here to speak with us about the lessons of history in terms of how the world will change after this pandemic. He's writing a big book on this right now, and we're going to have Neil Ferguson with you live Wednesday, May 6th at 8 p.m. In the next 2 weeks, just to give you a tease of who we're going to have on the show. Kara Swisher, a fantastic analyst, contributor, and thinker on big tech in the Silicon Valley, how it's going to be impacted by this pandemic and how it's in effect reshaping a lot of society as this pandemic rolls on. So a conversation about big tech after COVID, and Scott Gottlieb, who you saw there, was the FDA commissioner previously in the United States and has been one of the leading commentators on COVID-19, and he's going to be speaking with us about the future of pandemics generally and the public health response. So two terrific dialogues coming up. And just some thank yous before we go to Janice Stein. I just want to acknowledge our funders tonight. It's important to note that these dialogues are brought to you entirely as a charitable exercise that is the result of the leadership of the Peter and Melanie Munk Foundation and its sister foundation, the Aurea Foundation, that were established to promote the Munk debates and to promote informed, thoughtful discussion about the world of ideas, public policy, and the challenges we face as a country. So thank you to both foundations. And also just to recognize a number of the partners that we've been working with to bring these events to you: the Globe and Mail, Amber Mac Media, our friends at PBS in the United States, out of Buffalo, WNED, MAP Productions, Facebook, and Antica. So again, a great team that's coming together. We're adding more each week. By the end of these 10 weeks, who knows, we may have taken over public broadcasting in Canada. We'll see. But look, let's continue our conversation now. We're going to have Janice Gross-Stein joining us. She's one of Canada's leading experts on international affairs. And Janice is going to talk with me about Canada's role in the global stage, but specifically how it affects our development as a country internationally when we're emerging from this pandemic, when we have these complicated global changes going on, when we have these institutions, these global institutions under acute stress. So Janice, great to have you here to speak with us tonight. Let's begin maybe just by getting your reactions to Samantha Power's remarks. Was there anything particular that you'd like to pull out of those for a Canadian audience that you think it would benefit for them to focus on?
You know, great to be back with you, Richard. That was a fascinating conversation. I think there are 2 or 3 points that are really relevant to Canada here. The first is the discussion of global institutions. She's right that the conflict between the United States and China is deepening, and that's just very tough on international institutions. So what should Canadians do? I think we have to be really strategic and decide which of those institutions do we want to dig in on and make better? Because we can't do it all. And we've already, in effect, done this for two. And I don't know how much Canadians know about that. But we've already convened a group of like-minded countries because President Trump has paralyzed the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And he's done that by refusing to appoint judges. So you cannot now have a dispute resolved. Our government has pulled together representatives from different countries, and they're working really hard in something called the Ottawa process to come up with suggestions for workarounds. That's a really grounded, practical thing that will benefit Canadians if we can have strong and vital dispute resolutions. Now, what about the WHO? As you said, Roger, the epicenter of the controversy. I would disagree with Samantha here. I don't think it was as good a performance as it could have been, frankly. I think most Canadians know that. But is the answer to do what Trump did, just cut the funding and weaken it so that it becomes more difficult? I think the answer is to work hard at making that institution much better. This is not the first time the WHO has failed to live up to expectations. And I'm not one of those who makes excuses for it because it doesn't have people on the ground, has a small budget. I think it can be a lot better than it is, but it's only going to get better if countries like Canada really engage. Second big point, I don't know how much time we have here.
No, go ahead.
Is the border, which you asked Samantha about. It's really astonishing that the Canada-U.S. border is closed to everything but essential trade. Mm-hmm. And it's important that we remember that the trucks are rolling, the supply chains are working. So how is this border closed now, Roger? You and I cannot take a commercial flight and go to the United States. There is speculation that President Trump would like to reopen that border and that our prime minister will come under some pretty tough pressure. But here's the story, and Samantha talked about working with governors, but here's an interesting fact for Canadians. For 35 states in the United States, we, Canada, are their largest trading partner. We know that, and we have a strategy which gets our premiers and the heads of our businesses to work with governors in those 35 states and send that message. The border is now no longer a story between the prime minister and the president. It's a story right across Canada with governors and counterpart institutions right across the United States.
So what's your bet on that, Janice? Do you think the border reopens sooner? Do you think, obviously there's a public health consideration, but there's an economic consideration too. And more importantly, as you alluded to it, there's just a kind of bizarre cultural schism here for two countries that have been bound together for 2.5 centuries to suddenly have real, as you say, no mobility between the two except essential critical travel.
It's astonishing, Richard. It's hard to think of any Canadian prime minister in living memory who would be resisting a request to open up the border. We have spent our whole history
trying to get more
That's
across the border.
Our modern history, anyway. You think of John Manley after 9/11, mobilizing everything and everybody to get that border with the United States open. Here's my bet. I think the president will push to get it reopened. And I think in one of those absolutely astounding moments in history, we will resist until, and that's partly because the management of the pandemic in the United States has been so awful. And it would certainly not serve our interests, nor theirs, frankly, if we had open travel coming in and people were carrying the virus with them. I think we'll resist, and we will wait until the United States is doing a better job of managing the pandemic. So we do have a thicker border now. Now, again, remember what we're talking about. We're talking about tourism. We're talking about cars crossing the border. We're talking about hospitality. We're talking about entertainment. We are not talking about essential trade. And those kinds of activities are so far down the road, I think we'll resist.
Janice, we're going to go to Facebook questions in a moment, but I've got to ask you about what you see as Canada's kind of position globally coming out of this, because Samantha painted a picture, I think, and you alluded to it, of a fairly dark world, a world of increasing geopolitical tension going into this crisis between China and the United States, a world that is rapidly amping up that conflict and tension. The president today alluding publicly that he, I guess, supposedly has knowledge that this virus emerged from a laboratory in Wuhan. I mean, a remarkable allegation to muse about. I don't know if he's formally making it. But these things suggest that for middle powers, smaller countries like Canada, we will face a very challenging global terrain. What's your thought on that? And more importantly, what's your advice to how Canada finds its interests, secures its way in that world of crushing competition?
You know, Roger, this is a really tough one. There's probably no bigger question for this country over the next 5 years. You know, not only did President Trump make that allegation, but he certainly said that he intends to demand from China that it compensate those who have been sickened or died from the coronavirus, because the coronavirus was not originally controlled by China, and he wants to hold them legally responsible. Well, the Chinese just exploded with rage, frankly, in the last 24 hours over that one. You know, geography is destiny, or at least a good part of destiny. We live next door to the United States. Nothing is going to change that. Our economies are so interlinked, Roger. And even before this pandemic, and I think the pandemic is going to really accelerate this, globalization was pulling back, and we're seeing more and more what we call regional economies, which just puts Canada squarely in North America. Well, North America is not, frankly, right now, the kind of place it was before 2016. And so we have to do our best within reason to maintain relations with China, but we have to be tough-minded. We have to understand where our core economic interests are, where our core health interests are, where our core strategic interests are. And our government, I mean any government, whether it's a liberal government or a conservative government, I believe that any Canadian government for the next 10 years is going to be more assertive in asserting Canada's interests. And there's going to be pushback in a funny way, not against China, certainly, but also against the United States. So the message is going to be, here's what we think is absolutely essential. You know, we talk about resiliency, we talk about strategic stockpiles. We need these. That's what our public is demanding. And listen, don't take offense, because you're doing the same thing. And I think that's where any Canadian government's going to go.
Great. Well, let's go to some questions
on
Facebook for you from our audience that's tuning in from across Canada and around the world. Diana is asking, will Canada push for more immigration to keep the economy humming and growing? So, Janice, we've seen President Trump suspend immigration to the United States, playing to his base. I understand right now that just as out of simple necessity, not because of policy, but immigration intake has been halted because they just can't process people safely into the country as new arrivals. So Does the Canadian consensus on immigration remain firmly entrenched after this pandemic has passed?
You phrase that question in a really great way, Roger. Does the Canadian consensus on immigration remain as firmly entrenched? There was a little erosion in that even before the pandemic occurred. But I think immigration becomes a greater strategic advantage for Canada as other countries close their borders. And that's what we're seeing everywhere in the world right now, frankly, as a result of COVID-19. If you look at our high-tech sector, we've made amazing progress in the last 3 or 4 years. That's been driven by the talent that we have been able to bring into this country. Our universities are changed as a result of the number of foreign students that we bring to this country. Foreign students are going to have an awful time getting into the United States in the fall of 2020. We will get the cream of the world's crop if we are able to bring students to Canada, test appropriately at the border, and that should not be impossible for us, and quarantine, if necessary, for 2 weeks any student who's suspected of having the virus. When those students come here, they stay here, they enrich our talent pool, sometimes in areas that are critical for this country, and we really benefit at a time when other countries are turning their back. So I think it's really important for our government to go out and make the case in the strongest possible way that in a very tough world, which we are moving into, I was saying to somebody today, Roger, it's never been as tough for Canada as it is right now. We grew up under Britain. We became a teenager under the United States, and now we're grown up and we're out there on our own.
A midlife crisis.
That's right. And in that kind of world, when you have a strategic advantage, you make the most of it.
Right. Okay, let's take some more questions from our online audience who's been watching away. Nancy asks, is there realistically any role that Canada can play to manage or influence the relationship between the U.S. and China? So, great question from Nancy there. Could we, historically, we've liked to think of ourselves that way. Again, that constructive middle power, Lester B. Pearson's Nobel Peace Prize, the list is long, the legend is long, the mythology persists.
You're right. Nancy is asking a question that many Canadian prime ministers have asked themselves. During the height of the Cold War, when relationships were frigid between Russia and the United States, somebody called Prime Minister Trudeau developed a special relationship with Russia in order to interpret the United States to Russia and back. How successful have we been at that when we look at it in the cold light of day, Roger? Not very, frankly. We tell ourselves that we have been, but China and the United States have many points of contact, both in the private sector, where there still are some good relationships, at the official level, at the scientific level. It's not really clear how much of a difference our government can make in a relationship that is getting worse by the month, that is angry, where the language is hostile. Not a big surprise, by the way, started long before COVID, but it's just getting much, much worse.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions. I'm conscious that we're coming up on the bottom of the hour here, which will conclude our dialogue for tonight. So Ian Bromley's got a question for you. Janice, why has Canada so far seemed immune to the nationalist authoritarian tendencies in the United States? What's going on here, he asks. Enlightened self-interest, our cultural values. I've got an answer to this, Janice, but let's hear yours first.
You go first, Roger.
Oh, going to put me on the spot. What was that answer? I think it has something to do with our regionalism. I think we have very strong regional identities in this country, and that a lot of the tensions that you see exhibited in other advanced democracies, these are playing out within national states that have, they're not even federal states, they're unitary states. So the tensions, the fault lines between right and left become the battlegrounds of politics, whereas in Canada, I think those strong regional identities allow us to fight over differences that are primarily regional differences, not ideological differences. Those absolutely do exist, but they're not the sum, the totality of our political culture. I had the privilege, Janice, of having you, like so many Canadians who are lucky enough, as my professor of international relations when I was a student at U of T. So what grade would you give me on that answer? B plus,
that
B
gets
minus?
an A for sure.
Way to go.
And I would just add one other thing that I think makes Canada a little better able. It has better shock absorbers in its systems. From the moment the country was created, we in Canada lived with a deep knowledge that there was another people, another nation, or nations inside the country. And so we are better at living with others, better at living with difference, better, frankly, at compromising without going to the extremes than many other countries are. If you look at our neighbor to the south, they haven't had that tradition. They have a story that really says they all are Americans in the same way, and they minimize the differences in the culture. So I think we're just better at it. And frankly, we're blessed. We're one of the few democracies in the developed world that has not had the kind of politics that we see most clearly in the United States, but it's in France, it's in Germany, it's in Italy, it's in Britain. We are really blessed in this country.
That's a good note. Let's squeeze one more question in, Janice, for you. You've been really generous to spend this time with us tonight. It's from Joshua Freeman. He's saying, to what extent might Canada's international trade position be reshaped by the pandemic, especially with the respect to oil? So, Janice, we've seen this sharp correction in oil prices as demand around the world has collapsed. This has put real pressure, causing, in fact, a shut-in of a lot of our energy production in Western Canada. So how do you see our trade relationships moving forward, and more particularly, what do we do about Alberta and in a sense, a crisis of energy that was happening in this country before this pandemic? If we remember, there were protests by Native Canadians and their supporters regarding pipelines and hydrocarbon exploitation here in Canada. This is a hot issue for us.
It is.
Does that issue get not resolved, but put to the side while we confront this pandemic and the economic fallout?
That is, I think, one of the biggest and most important questions this country faces. You're absolutely right, Roger, that, this is one more example where COVID did not create the problem. It just exacerbated it. This problem was becoming acute before the virus spread. If we talk about oil as part of our trade, it is a large export, but it goes fundamentally only to one market, which is the United States. And the reason that is the case, we do not have the pipeline capacity and the capacity to offload oil onto tankers that can go to Asia, where there is still a huge demand. And these are not short-term problems. Building pipelines, as you know, in this country, can take a decade. Because of regulations, because of protests, because of land claims. So fundamentally, our exports of oil go to one market. And as long as there's a glut in that market, there is not going to be a tremendous demand for Alberta product. Now, how long will the price of oil stay as depressed as it is? Probably, it will stay as depressed only as long as demand is depressed by the pandemic. Once we begin to come out, even if it's a L-shaped curve, if it's a slow recovery, demand will pick up and there will be demand again for Alberta oil. But this can be, for the Alberta economy, probably the combination of the two, probably one of the most difficult and challenging periods in the history of modern Alberta. The dislocation is impossible to exaggerate. Mm-hmm. It's really tough.
Yeah, key point. And we're thinking about our fellow citizens in Alberta, in Western Canada, who are bearing the brunt of this record slump in commodity prices for their economy.
Here's a more cheerful note, though, Roger.
Yes.
Because we don't get a lot about. Let's think about another sector in Canada which can really grow in the current trading environment, which is agribusiness and agricultural export. There is huge concern with food security all around the world with broken supply chains. We're seeing it in the meatpacking industry right now. We saw it with flour. You just go into your local grocery. And Canada has huge potential in the agribusiness sector. That is also a sector where Alberta can have a much brighter future, frankly. So the news is not all bad here for Canada.
Yeah, it's important to remember. Well, Janice Gross-Stein, thank you for coming on the Munk Dialogues to share your analysis and insights. Great to have you on again. Let's do this again.
A pleasure.
Great. Well, I was speaking with Janice Gross-Stein. She's a professor of conflict management at the University of Toronto and a founder of the Munk School of Global Affairs, a sister aligned organization to that of the Munk Dialogues and the Munk Debates. So that concludes our Munk Dialogue for this evening. As I mentioned, up next week, we have a Munk Dialogue with Neil Ferguson. Neil Ferguson's been a regular on the Munk Debate stage. He's one of the brightest historians and public intellectuals of his time. We're going to have him on Wednesday, May 6th at 8 p.m. to talk about the lessons of history for this pandemic. What do past pandemics tell us about how this pandemic will change society? Coming up in the following weeks, we have some great conversations. Kara Swisher is going to be on to talk about big tech in Silicon Valley and its impact on society, how that will be accelerated most likely by this pandemic. And then we have Scott Gottlieb on. You've seen him on the news repeatedly through this pandemic. He's the former chairman of the FDA in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, and one of the world's leading experts on public health and pandemics. He's going to talk to us about the big public health challenges coming out of this pandemic and what could change in the years ahead. So just finally to thank our hosts here. They're the hosts of the Munk Debates. They're also the hosts of the Munk Dialogues, and that's the Peter and Melanie Munk Foundation and its sister foundation, the Aurea Foundation, both of which are making these dialogues possible through their charitable giving. This is an entirely charitable exercise supported by our partners who are donating in-kind services and are essential to the success of this project: the Globe and Mail, Amber Mac Media, WNED, WBFO, PBS station out of Buffalo, part of the NPR family, MAP Productions, Facebook, and Antica Productions. So again, thanks for watching. We'll do this all again next week with Neil Ferguson. Don't miss that dialogue. Details on our website, www.munkdebates.com. I'm Rudyard Griffiths. Good night. you.